Saturday, February 23rd, 2019, Maneco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. So very nice day today in London. Sunny, fairly warm for this time of the year. So almost like spring, even though we're still in February. Today I want to talk about Frederick Bastiat and this book here, The Law. So the classic blueprint for a just society. It will show you my view on politics, government, and the function of government, on democracy, what I think of it. So many of you probably know already how I feel about these things, but as I get more and more new subscribers, new viewers, I like to talk about these things. I know I do focus on the markets, mostly in precious metals, but I think this is very important as well because it's to do with the way society is run, especially nowadays with all the division so-called between capitalism and socialism, the people coming up like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders versus capitalism, Donald Trump, democracy, Venezuela. I mean, some of the stuff Frederick Bastiat talked about, and this was in the mid-1800s, is so, it makes so much sense, and it's timeless. It applies to human nature so forever, in my opinion. It's only just over 70 pages, this book, so I highly recommend people read it. I'm going to go through some of the important parts of this book that I think will give you my idea of how things could be, hopefully. Before I go on to the book, let's read here. Frederick Bastiat, 1801-1850, was a French economist, statesman, and writer. His uncompromising defense of free trade, the market economy, and individual liberty pitted him against politicians both right and left. So there you go, right and left. His writings include economic sophisms, which championed free trade, economic harmonies, a treatise on economic principles, plus a host of essays including the state and what is seen and what is not seen. To this day, his witty aphorisms and incisive arguments are quoted by public figures, speakers, and writers everywhere. Well, Frederick Bastiat also said one of his quotes is, "The state is that great fiction by which everyone wants to live at the expense of everyone else." That was Frederick Bastiat. So yeah, what I get from Bastiat, the law is supposed to protect people's life, liberty, and property, and that those things came before the law. So let's go into the book itself. I've taken a few points that I think are really interesting, and I think it's very important nowadays with all the so-called Gilets jaunes, or the yellow vests, the socialist movement, capitalism, all the division, the 1%. And I think it's really important that people, if everyone could read this book, I think the world would be a much better place. So let's start from the beginning. The law. And this is what Frederick Bastiat says, and I don't have a problem in saying it. Some of you might feel different about it, but it doesn't concern me. He says, life is a gift from God. You might believe there is no God, but there is something out there that helps create the world we're in, right? So let's have a look. What does he say? The creator of life has entrusted us with the responsibility of preserving, developing, and perfecting it. In order that we may accomplish this, he has provided us with a collection of marvelous faculties, and he has put us in the midst of a variety of natural resources. by the application of our facilities to these natural resources, we convert them into products and use them. This process is necessary in order that life may run its appointed course. Makes sense to me. And he goes on to say, life, faculties, production, in other words, individuality, liberty, property, this is man. Nowadays you could say this is man and woman, okay? This is in the 1850s. And in spite of the cunning of artful political leaders, these three gifts from God precede all human legislation and are superior to it. So there you go. I guess that's why communists, socialists, and even nowadays people who are not communists or socialists, like the New Old Order, that's why they're not really, they believe the state is God. So they've turned things around, haven't they? We come into what is the law? What then is the law? Well, it is the collective organization of the individual right to lawful defense. Each of us has a natural right from God to defend his person, liberty, and his property. These are the three basic requirements of life, and the preservation of any one of them is completely dependent on the preservation of the other two. For what are our faculties but the extension of our individuality? And what is property but an extension of our faculties? So this is the important part of what the law is. If every person has the right to defend, even by force, his person, his liberty, and his property, then it follows that a group of men or women have the right to organize and support a common force to protect these rights constantly. So the law is the collective right of society, of individuals, to help protect themselves, their life, liberty, and property. He talks about as well how the law has been perverted, the complete perversion of the law. But unfortunately, law by no means confines itself to its proper functions. And when it has exceeded its proper functions, it has done so merely in some inconsequential and debatable matters. The law has gone further than this. It has acted in direct opposition to its own purpose. The law has been used to destroy its own objective. It has been applied to annihilating the justice that it was supposed to maintain, to limiting and destroying rights which its real purpose was to respect. The law has placed the collective force of the disposal of the unscrupulous who wish without risk to exploit person, liberty, and property of others. It has converted plunder into a right in order to protect plunder, and it has converted lawful defense into a crime in order to punish lawful defense. He also talks about a fatal tendency of mankind. So this is what he says: self-preservation and self-development are common aspirations among all people, and if everyone enjoyed the unrestricted use of his or her faculties and the free disposition of the fruits of his labor, social progress would be ceaseless, uninterrupted, and unfailing. But there's also another tendency that is common among people. This is the fatal tendency. When they can, they wish to live and prosper at the expense of others. This is no rash accusation, nor does it come from a gloomy and uncharitable spirit. The annals of history bear witness to the truth. The incessant wars, mass migrations, religious persecutions, universal slavery, dishonesty in commerce and monopolies. The fatal desire has its origins in the very nature of man, in the primitive, universal, and insuppressible instinct that impels him to satisfy his desires with the least possible pain. This is an interesting part here. He talks about the victims of lawful plunder, because we need to differentiate between lawful plunder, which is done by legislation, what we have today, and illegal plunder. What's illegal plunder? Well, illegal plunder is something that has been fought since beginning of times is to protect yourself from plunder, from individuals that are criminal, that try to steal from you, rob you, or attack you, or kill you. That's normal, and there's nothing wrong with that, and that would not cease under a system of limited government and just government that Bastiat espouses. So, victims of lawful plunder or legal plunder. Men naturally rebel against injustices of which they are victims. Thus, when plunder is organized by law for the profit of those who make the law, all the plundered classes try somehow to enter by peaceful or revolutionary means into the making of laws. So this is what's going on now. That's why I've said before that all the isms is just a waste of time and a distraction. Right now, we do have lawful plunder, and people call it capitalism, but it's just a small group of people who control everything. They've usurped the law to make it into an instrument of plunder. How have they done that? Well, the Federal Reserve is one example. The Inland Revenue is one example. The Import-Export Bank in the United States, for example, it gives subsidies to big corporations to export abroad. So what we've had, and the bailout of the big banks in '08, that was lawful plunder. So now, and these people have enriched themselves, and that's why now the plundered classes, the people, the populists, or the socialists, they're trying to get into the game. They want to plunder. So that's the example, two wrongs don't make a right. That's what I'm trying to say here. We're not going to get anywhere by choosing socialism or even choosing the system we have now. The system we have now is a system of lawful plunder. And he goes on to say, according to their degree of enlightenment, these plundered classes may propose one of two entirely different purposes when they attempt to attain political power. Either they may wish to stop lawful plunder, or they may wish to share in it. And that's what socialism is. And am I saying that only socialism is wrong? No, I'm also saying that the system we have now is wrong. You might want to call it capitalism. You might want to call it crony capitalism. You might want to call it financial capitalism, whatever. This is an interesting comment he makes here, and this is what is concerning, in my opinion. Woe to the nation when this latter purpose prevails among the mass victims of lawful plunder, when they in turn seize the power to make laws. So you might be asking a question, well, but they're making laws now that help the 1%. Yes, that's true, but they're not really legitimate laws, because the law, as Bastiat says, should be minimal. It should be an instrument to protect life, liberty, and property. One very controversial point he makes is that is about democracy and universal suffrage and how many people are allowed to vote. Because nowadays we're told that the more people that vote, the better. That it would be unfair to have just a certain people, a segment of society vote, so we have universal suffrage. But he makes a great point. He says it doesn't really matter if you vote or not. Yeah, and this is the controversial part, but I think it makes sense what he says. He says here, if the law were confined to its proper functions, everyone's interest in the law would be the same. Protect the individual, protect the individual's property, liberty, life. It is not clear that under these circumstances, those who voted could not inconvenience those who did not vote. So basically, he's turning the idea of democracy and voting completely upside down. We're always told, well, write to your representative. If you don't vote, it's your fault. You're never gonna get things done. So what Bastiat is saying here, that it doesn't really matter if you live in a society where the law is just, where it's there just to protect the individual life, liberty, and property, and is not abused by society to plunder sectors of society. It doesn't really matter if you vote or not. It goes on to say, but on the other hand, imagine that this fatal principle has been introduced under the pretense of organization, regulation, protection, and encouragement. The law takes property from one person and gives it to another. The law takes the wealth of all and gives it to a few, whether farmers, manufacturers, ship owners, artists, or comedians. Under these circumstances, then certainly every class will aspire to grasp the law, and logically so. So you see, he even talks about that, the law, here helping farmers, manufacturers, ship owners, the 1%, here in the UK or EU law, there's farm subsidies, and you have people who have huge land holdings in the UK that get subsidies from the EU. That's lawful plunder for the few. Does that mean that we should have lawful plunder for the many? No, they're both wrong. He goes on to say the excluded classes, the 99%, will furiously demand their right to vote and will overthrow society than not to obtain it. Even beggars and vagabonds will then prove to you that they also have an incontestable title to vote. They will say to you, we cannot buy wine, tobacco, or salt without paying the tax. And part of the tax that we pay is given by law in privileges and subsidies to men who are richer than we are. So there you go. The other point he makes is about the United States, because he wrote this in 1850. And he asks the question, is there any need to offer proof that this odious perversion of the law is a perpetual source of hatred and discord, that it tends to destroy society itself? If such proof is needed, look at the United States in 1850. There is no country in the world where the law is kept more within its proper domain, the protection of every person's liberty, property. As a consequence of this, there appears to be no country in the world where the social order rests on a firmer foundation. But even in the United States, there are two issues, and only two, that have always endangered the public peace. And he goes on. So what are these two issues? They are slavery and tariffs. These are the only two issues where, contrary to the general spirit of the Republic of the United States, law has assumed the character of a plunderer. Notice that he doesn't say the democracy of the United States. Slavery is a violation by law of liberty. The protective tariff is a violation by law of property. So there you go, Mr. Trump. It is a more remarkable fact that this double legal crime, a sorrowful inheritance from the old world, should be the only issue which can and perhaps will lead to ruin of the Union. Well, this was 1850. Look what happened about 11 years later. It is indeed impossible to imagine at the very heart of a society a more astounding fact than this. The law has come to be an instrument of injustice. And if this fact brings terrible consequences to the United States, where the proper purpose of the law has been perverted only in the instances of slavery and tariffs, what must be the consequences in Europe, where the perversion of the law is a principle, a system? Another interesting part of the book that I think is good that we look into is how to identify legal plunder. And he says, But how is this legal plunder to be identified? Quite simply, see if the law takes from some persons what belongs to them and gives it to other persons to whom it does not belong. See if the law benefits one citizen at the expense of another by doing what the citizen himself cannot do without committing a crime. Then abolish this law without delay, for it is not only an evil itself, but also is a fertile source for further evils because it invites reprisals. Legal plunder has many names. So he says, now legal plunder can be committed in an infinite number of ways. Thus we have an infinite number of plans for organizing it. Tariffs, protection, benefits, subsidies, encouragements, progressive taxation, public schools, guaranteed jobs, guaranteed profits. Well, that's Wall Street, isn't it? They've got the guaranteed profits and also limited losses. Minimum wages, a right to relief, a right to the tools of labor, free credit, and so on and so on. All these plans as a whole with their common aim of legal plunder constitute socialism. So we don't even, basically we've got socialism or capitalism. It's all a mix. I guess socialism is legal or lawful plunder for the many, and capitalism as we have today is legal or lawful plunder for the few. So what's the choice before us? Well, it's really simple. It's not rocket science. He goes on to say, this question of legal plunder must be settled once and for all, and there are only three ways to settle it. Number one, the few plunder the many. That's what we got now. Number two, everybody plunders everybody. That's what it seems like a lot of people want to do. Miss Ocasio-Cortez, Mr. Bernie Sanders, Mr. Jeremy Corbyn, the MMT, modern monetary theory proponents. And then there's the third choice, which I think is the best choice, but is a very difficult course to take, mainly because of the fatal tendency of mankind to want something with very little effort, of course. And that is, nobody plunders anybody. And of course, there will always be those who plunder people, and that's called illegal plunder. And that's what government and the law is there to protect people from, not to institute it. And he goes on to say, we must make our choice among limited plunder, universal plunder, or no plunder. The law can follow only one of these three. Limited legal plunder, what does he say that is? This system prevailed when the right to vote was restricted. One would turn back to the system to prevent the invasion of socialism. Universal legal plunder. We have been threatened with this system since the franchise was made universal. The newly enfranchised majority has decided to formulate law on the same principle of legal plunder that was used by their predecessors when the vote was limited. I would argue that nowadays the vote is limited because the big corporations and the big interests have really neutered universal legal plunder. No legal plunder. This is the principle of justice, peace, order, stability, harmony, and logic. Until the day of my death, I shall proclaim this principle with all the force of my lungs. That was Bastiat, of course. So to end, let's look at the proper function of the law, what he says it is. And in all its sincerity, can anything more than the absence of plunder be required of the law? Can the law, which necessarily requires the use of force, rationally be used for anything except protecting the rights of everyone? I defy anyone to extend it beyond this purpose without perverting it and consequently turning might against right. So there you go. Highly recommend the book. There are free PDFs online, or if you go to Mises.org, you can also buy the book. You could probably find it on Amazon as well. The law. I go for nobody plunders anybody. Why should the law, which is supposed to protect the individual, actually attack the individual? It's all common sense. And that's why we need to get away from the division of socialism, capitalism, Marxism, social democracy, all those things. We need to focus on the individual, freedom, life, and liberty. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to my channel if you haven't yet. Make sure you also hit the little notification bell to be notified of my new videos. You can also follow me on Twitter, Steemit, and DTube. I wish you all a great weekend. Take care. Bye.